The motives of each serial and mass killer, also sources of fascination for the public, are not always made clear by the men themselves, but we are occasionally offered edifying glimpses. In Canada, for example, Marc Lépine, whose real name was Gamil Garbi, fatally shot 14 young female students at Montreal's École Polytechnique. He claimed he was fighting feminism since these women were defying the traditional roles to which women are supposed to conform, as per his Muslim father, himself allegedly abusive and contemptuous of women. Lépine also satisfied other criteria that correlate with dangerous behavior: rejection from the army, dropping out of college, having been fired from a menial hospital job because of poor attitude, admiration of Adolf Hitler, absence of girlfriends. 87. Another clear-cut woman-hater was California's Ed Kemper, 88, who was as bright as he was tall, 6 feet, 9 inches, 205 centimeters, in height, with an IQ of 145. His mother was admittedly stern, punitive, and domineering, though loyal whenever he was in trouble with the law. His older sister was reportedly abusive, and he cut off the heads of his younger sister's dolls. Still in adolescence, Kemper beheaded cats. Then, in his early 20s, he became a serial killer, murdering 6 female college students, later beheading his mother and her female friend. Afterward, he was said to have used some piece of his mother's body as a dartboard. Some sources claim the head. More disturbingly, as I learned from someone close to the Kemper investigation, it was his mother's genitals, perhaps an even more telling testimony to his misogyny. As to his poor luck developing friendships with women, Kemper remarked following his arrest, "While alive, women were unavailable to me. When dead, they're mine." Along with the question of motives among serial killers comes amazement at how adeptly some of these offenders are capable of masquerading as normal, leading double lives. Perhaps one of the most striking examples is that of Keith Jesperson, who demonstrated an unusually wide disparity between his public and private personas. The son and grandson of allegedly harsh and abusive Danish-Canadian men, Jesperson took out his anger on animals, especially cats, many of whom he tortured and killed, by way of relieving his tension. 89. He became a truck driver and, at age 20 in 1975, married. He and his wife had a son and 2 daughters before their divorce 7 years later. He was cheerful and pleasant with his children, never abusing them, except that he did kill their pet cats, which they found shocking and seemingly out of character. At 35, he committed the first of 8 known rape murders. When he visited his now teenage children shortly thereafter, he hinted to them about having committed some very bad crimes. He also made his elder daughter Melissa uncomfortable by telling her explicit details of his sexual activity with their mother and with a host of other women. This was Melissa's epiphany about how, inside her doting and sweet dad, lurked a brutal killer of women. After Jesperson was caught and imprisoned for the murders, his father visited him and told Melissa that he had once entertained thoughts of killing his 3 children. Melissa has written a book about her life as the daughter of a serial killer. 90. Unlike Lépine and Kemper, Jesperson did not hate all women. He instead showed a high degree of compartmentalization, or splitting, as we have described. Good women and their diametric opposites, bad women who deserve death. Moreover, Jesperson grew up in a broken home, as did Tommy Lynn Sells, but their cases differed in that Jesperson had a good mother. It was his father who was the cruel parent. These vignettes illustrate something about the diversity of background risk factors found in serial killers as a group. Some of these are general ones: genetic and constitutional predispositions to psychopathy, hypersexuality, aggressivity, low empathy. Others, to drive our point home, are found in higher percentages among men growing up in the 1960s and 1970s. Divorced families, maternal abandonment, absent fathers, resentment of women's lessening dependence on men. About 10% of serial killers are gay, but growing up during a period in which homophobic sentiments were more common and intense than is the case currently. Some struggled with a combination of self-hatred, identifying with the strong cultural prejudice, as well as with rejection by their own fathers and hatred of other gay men, whom they would kill, as if killing the unacceptable parts of their own self-images. Examples include Randy Kraft, Larry Eiler, John Wayne Gacy, Dean Corll, and Robert Berdella. There is also an overrepresentation of adoptees among serial killers, a reflection most likely of the less favorable genetic background from which adoptees have come. Once better birth control in the 1960s allowed young women from economically and educationally advantaged families to avoid unwanted pregnancies. In my series and in that of the FBI, serial killers were 6 to 8 times as likely, 12 to 16%, to have been adoptees as would be expected, 2%, in the general population. Solicitation. In the United States, the crime of solicitation involves encouraging, bribing, requesting, or commanding that a person commit a substantive crime, with the intent that the solicited person be the one who actually commits the criminal act. Before the era of New Evil, many cases were carried out by non-members, sometimes called sidearms, of the mafia, called Murder Incorporated, a group of enforcers hired for contract killings, usually of persons from one mafia organization who fell out of favor with the bosses of another. These hits, however, were not the products of narcissism run wild. They were strictly business, the fee often amounting to $1,000 to $5,000 per killing, non-negligible sum during Murder Inc.'s heyday of 1930-1940.91. A more common variety of solicitation to murder concerns the hiring of a hitman to eliminate someone whom a person seriously wants out of the way, in such a manner that the person can. As noted in our discussion of the gradations of evil scale, a fair number of spousal murders are initiated in this fashion. Passions often run high in custody cases, which are, as might be expected, much more frequent in the post-1965 era, thanks to the soaring divorce rate. We will touch upon custody in a separate section, but solicitation of someone to murder a spouse within the context of a contentious custody case is not common. A trial that garnered national attention a few years ago was that of Queens, New York, Dr. Mazoltov Borokova, whose first name is Hebrew for good luck. She hired her cousin Mikhail Malayev to kill her husband, orthodontist Dr. Daniel Malakov, after the court awarded him custody of their 4-year-old daughter. 92. In some ways more stunning than the preceding example is the solicitation by the mother of convicted serial rapist Fred Coe. 93. Coe was the son of the managing editor of a Spokane, Washington, newspaper. As though in a morbid demonstration of how blood is thicker than water, Coe's mother, a woman of high social standing in the community and a former charm school teacher, not only refused to accept her son's 1981 conviction and sentence of 75 years in prison, but also tried to hire a hitman for $4,000 to kill Judge Shields and the prosecutor, Donald Brucato. The hitman was an undercover policeman. She was found guilty of solicitation and was herself sentenced to prison, though just for a year. This was not family loyalty so much as narcissism, amorality, and arrogance of sorts, not unknown before the new era, but encountered more frequently, I believe, since the mid-1960s. Mrs. Coe discovered the pitfalls of hiring a stranger who can turn out to be a blackmailer or agent in disguise. Others, as in the cases we will now describe, have felt it a wiser choice to keep it in the family, only to discover it was just as perilous. Barbara Opel, an irascible, foul-mouthed, twice-divorced virago of 48, worked as the caretaker and companion of an elderly woman. 94. She displayed a mixture of narcissistic and psychopathic traits: entitlement, exploitativeness, envy, arrogance, but also amorality, characterized by a lack of guilt or remorse, and callousness. Her main motive was greed. Jerry Heyman, the son of the 89-year-old woman, was well-to-do. At first, Opel tried to steal from him by forging checks, but this netted her few additional funds. Next, she tried to poison Mr. Hyman with weed killer, but that, too, proved unsuccessful. So, in 2001, she turned to her 13-year-old daughter Heather, persuading her to seduce her boyfriend, Jerry Grote, as leverage to induce him to kill Mr. Hyman. Grote subsequently enlisted the aid of several other teenagers who hid in Hyman's house until the man returned one day. The boys waylaid him and clubbed him to death with baseball bats. Heather, for good measure, stabbed him in the neck, though, by then, he was already dead. Opal cleaned all the blood off the carpet, seemingly unaware of the impossibility of such a task, given the ease with which crime scene investigators can detect the most exiguous traces. Then she and the boys put the body in a car, which was dumped over the edge of a ravine. Heather's younger brother, 12 at the time, the only one in the entourage with a conscience, told the police about the crime a few days later, which put paid to the cleverness of his mother's scheme. Opal, Heather, and the boys were all arrested. Opal got life without parole, the others long sentences. What is remarkable about the case, and what gives it its overtones of new evil, is the chain of solicitation. Opal solicited Heather, who solicited boyfriend Jerry, who then solicited his buddies to murder Jerry Hyman, keeping it all in the family, the way Opal wished, only to be turned in by one of its own members. Legitimate orgy center. The clubs Joan and David joined were not as constrained as was Plato's Retreat, which prohibited alcohol and drugs, and only straight sex was permitted. Joan and David frequented clubs in which nothing was verboten. If you could think of it, you could do it. Joan, for example, had a penchant for threesomes, in which she submitted to anal sex with one man while simultaneously giving oral sex to another, the scene being videotaped by David, for home viewing later on. David did have one rule: everything was okay, so long as Joan did not begin to have feelings for one of the men with whom she swung. Their life at home was tempestuous. They argued and fought constantly, and, not surprisingly, Joan quickly did develop feelings for another man, a private named Jeffrey Wilson, who was married with 4 children. Wilson, apart from the swinging pastime, was devoted to his wife and family and had no romantic interest in Joan. He did spend some alone time with her for lunches and shopping, content to take advantage of the fact that, as a major's wife, she was better off and would pay for everything they did together. He would later candidly admit to this. Joan, in contrast, wanted to get rid of David, quite literally, and live happily ever after with Wilson, sharing the $700,000 she figured she would rake in from David's life insurance. Divorce was out of the question. David would continue to raise his 2 boys. Child support for Joan, whose girls were nearing 18, would be too little and too brief to support her in the style to which she had grown accustomed, and a private salary did not match a major's. Money trumping morals in Joan's internal lexicon, murder was the answer, but not by Joan. If she were caught, the $700,000 would be forfeited, even if she tried to weasel out of conviction by pretending he had beaten her or had sexually molested his stepdaughter. So Joan began to pressure Elizabeth to kill her stepfather, reassuring her that even if she, Elizabeth, were caught, she could tell the court he had raped her, and thus they would let her off with no more than a judicial slap on the wrist. Joan badgered her to get hold of a pistol from one of her teenage friends who belonged to the local Crips gang. David, of course, had many guns, but it would not be safe to use one of his own. Joan also urged Elizabeth to offer one of the members of the gang money to, quote, do the job. To their credit, her Crips friends would have no part of either offer. Finally, in desperation, Joan promised her daughter at first a few. Next, she tried to poison Mr. Hyman with weed killer, but that, too, proved unsuccessful. So in 2001, she turned to her 13-year-old daughter Heather, persuading her to seduce her boyfriend, Jerry Grote, as leverage to induce him to kill Mr. Hyman. Grote subsequently enlisted the aid of several other teenagers, who hid in Hyman's house until the man returned one day. The boys waylaid him and clubbed him to death with baseball bats. Heather, for good measure, stabbed him in the neck, though, by then, he was already dead. Opal cleaned all the blood off the carpet, seemingly unaware of the impossibility of such a task, given the ease with which crime scene investigators can detect the most exiguous traces, and she and the boys put the body in a car, which was dumped over the edge of a ravine. Heather's younger brother, 12 at the time, the only one in the entourage with a conscience, told the police about the crime a few days later, which put paid to the cleverness of his mother's scheme. Opal, Heather, and the boys were all arrested. Opal got life without parole, the others long sentences. What is remarkable about the case, and what gives it its overtones of new evil, is the chain of solicitation. Opal solicited Heather, who solicited boyfriend Jerry, who then solicited his buddies to murder Jerry Hyman, keeping it all in the family, the way Opal wished, only to be turned in by one of its own members. Legitimate orgy center. The clubs Joan and David joined were not as constrained as was Plato's Retreat, which prohibited alcohol and drugs, and only straight sex was permitted. Joan and David frequented clubs in which nothing was verboten. If you could think of it, you could do it. Joan, for example, had a penchant for threesomes, in which she submitted to anal sex with one man, while simultaneously giving oral sex to another, the scene being videotaped by David, for home viewing later on. David did have one rule: everything was okay, so long as Joan did not begin to have feelings for one of the men with whom she swung. Their life at home was tempestuous. They argued and fought constantly, and, not surprisingly, Joan quickly did develop feelings for another man, a private named Jeffrey Wilson, who was married with 4 children. Wilson, apart from the swinging pastime, was devoted to his wife and family and had no romantic interest in Joan. He did spend some alone time with her for lunches and shopping, content to take advantage of the fact that, as a major's wife, she was better off and would pay for everything they did together. He would later candidly admit to this. Joan, in contrast, wanted to get rid of David, quite literally, and live happily ever after with Wilson, sharing the $700,000 she figured she would rake in from David's life insurance. Divorce was out of the question. David would continue to raise his 2 boys. Child support for Joan, whose girls were nearing 18, would be too little and too brief to support her in the style to which she had grown accustomed. And a private salary did not match a major's. Money trumping morals in Joan's internal lexicon, murder was the answer, but not by Joan. If she were caught, the $700,000 would be forfeited, even if she tried to weasel out of conviction by pretending he had beaten her or had sexually molested his stepdaughter. So Joan began to pressure Elizabeth to kill her stepfather, reassuring her that even if she, Elizabeth, were caught, she could tell the court he had raped her, and thus they would let her off with no more than a judicial slap on the wrist. Joan badgered her to get hold of a pistol from one of her teenage friends who belonged to the local Crips gang. David, of course, had many guns, but it would not be safe to use one of his own. Joan also urged Elizabeth to offer one of the members of the gang money to, quote, do the job. To their credit, her Crips friends would have no part of either offer. Finally, in desperation, Joan promised her daughter at first a few $1,000s to do the deed, and then later a fourth of the whole $700,000 windfall. Elizabeth at last promised to kill David, not for the money, but because she could not stand the continued pressure from her mother, nor the worry what her mother might do to her if Elizabeth told the police. This was the setting in which Elizabeth, on cue, sneaked at midnight into the bedroom where her mother and stepfather lay and shot David to death in the head and chest with a pistol provided by her mother as he slumbered. Joan and Elizabeth were quickly apprehended. Joan tried to pretend an intruder had broken in and killed David, and has maintained her innocence even to this day, although now in prison for life with no possibility of parole. Elizabeth has made a moving confession, adding that her stepfather had never laid an improper hand on her. She has been sentenced to 25 years in prison. Wilson made an equally eloquent confession about the swinging and about just using Joan for the free lunches and shopping goodies, never having had the slightest intention to leave his wife and family. He was demoted 1 grade in his Army ranking. The Shannon case has earned a great deal of publicity over the years. This is due, I believe, to the radical decoupling of sex and marriage among those swingers, in a much more worrisome and degrading way than anything Christopher Lasch inveighed against decades ago. Murders of spouses and intimate partners. The original title for this section was uxoricide, meaning the killing of one's wife, since wives are much more at risk for being killed by husbands than vice versa. Yet, there are wives who do kill husbands, as was the case in the last example about solicitation. According to a 2017 report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, more than 55% of homicides against women in the United States were related to violence on the parts of partners who were chiefly male. This finding was found to be true across all racial and ethnic groups, although significantly higher rates were observed among women who were Black, 4.4 per 100,000 people, or Indigenous, 4.3 per 100,000 people. 0.96 U.S. Department of Justice statistics tell us that, between 1980 and 2008, 41.5% of female murder victims were killed by intimates who were chiefly male, while only 7.1% of male homicides. Murdered males during this period were typically the victims of acquaintances, 56.4%, or strangers, 25.5%, 0.97. The risk for intimate partner homicide is increased by a factor of 3 in homes where there are guns present, 0.98. Since wife murder is more common than husband murder, we will begin the discussion with uxoricide. There is no corresponding legal phrase for husband murder. One could coin an analogous term, mariticide, from the Latin maritus for husband, but it is awkward. The typical man who kills a wife or girlfriend does so on impulse, on the spur of the moment, in a moment of rage. This may represent the culmination of long-standing dissatisfaction or disagreement. He usually does so by gunshot, stabbing, or bludgeoning. Even if there has been a bit of malice aforethought, the execution is, in a manner of speaking, unimaginative, and not the stuff of a mystery novel. This commonplace picture is as true of the new era as of previous periods. In the earlier two-thirds of the last century, even intimate partner murders among the rich and famous generally followed this mundane pattern. Consider a high-profile murder that took place in 1906. Chester Gillette, the son of wealthy parents, met a woman, Grace Brown, when he was working in his uncle's factory. They had an affair, and Brown became pregnant. She was hoping he would marry her, and pressed Gillette for an answer. It came in the form of his inviting her boating on a lake in the Adirondacks. When they had rowed a certain ways out, Gillette struck her on the head with either an oar or a tennis racket and pushed her into the water, where she drowned. The crime became the basis for Theodore Dreiser's famous 1925 novel, An American Tragedy, but what made it noteworthy was the prominence of the Gillette family, not the cleverness of the murder, for which Chester Gillette was executed a year and a half later. 0.99. Consider also a 1938 murder by Rodney Grieg, a young man from Oakland, California, who became enamored of a woman, Leona Vloot, whom he had met in a cafe and taken on a single date. A half-year later he encountered her again, and without provocation, he plunged a hunting knife into her chest, killing her instantly. Despite an insanity plea, he was executed a year later. Gregg was a morose loner, but not at all psychotic. The motive seemed to be a kind of abstract jealousy. Vloot was not close to him at all, and he could make no claim she cheated on him. It was more a question of his rage that he was infatuated with her, but forced to realize she was beyond his reach. 100. These pre-1960 intimate partner murders were, for the most part, fairly routine, a drowning and a stabbing with commonplace motivations. Nothing exotic. He could make no claim she cheated on him. It was more a question of his rage that he was infatuated with her but forced to realize she was beyond his reach. 100. These pre-1960 intimate partner murders were, for the most part, fairly routine, a drowning and a stabbing with commonplace motivations. Nothing exotic. As we approach the 1960s, we begin to find stories in which spouses or intimates are murdered in not so unusual ways, but in contexts that constitute veritable grade B novels come to life, sometimes by characters other than the victim's partner. We find an example of this in the case of Frank Duncan, who was one of the many children of the 11-time, some say 20-time, married Elizabeth Ann Duncan. 101. Despite her many options, she was pathologically attached, some thought incestuously attached, to Frank, who had lived with his mother all of his 30 years in their Santa Barbara, California home. Whether the incest was frank, no pun intended, or only psychological, remained uncertain. Ironically, when Frank finally began to assert his independence, Elizabeth made a suicide gesture with pills and was then aided in her recovery by a young nurse, Olga Kupchik. Frank fell in love with Olga and married her secretly in early 1958. By the fall, Olga was pregnant, and Elizabeth had learned of her son's, quote, betrayal. In 1958, she and a 25-year-old man, Ralph Winterstein, whom she hired, posed as Olga and Frank in court and had the marriage annulled. Elizabeth then determined to kill Olga. She found some willing hitmen and told them a tall tale about how Olga was blackmailing her son so that the men would feel they were doing the right thing in getting rid of a pregnant, seemingly innocent woman. The two hitmen abducted Olga, took her into Mexican territory, and when their pistol failed to fire, strangled her to death. 4 years later, all three, Elizabeth and the hired killers, were executed. So this was an uxoricide too, but a novelistic, if not unique, one in that the wife was murdered not by her husband, who loved his wife, but by his mother. In many of its features, it was a harbinger of the types of homicides to come in the following decade. The boundless narcissism of Elizabeth Duncan, her selfishness, ruthlessness, arrogance, and contempt for the conventional limits of social behavior is encountered with a certain regularity in the era of new evil. The direct means of murder change but little. Murder has only so many direct methods: shooting, stabbing, strangling, burning, bludgeoning, poisoning. What we see more and more of in the current era is a peculiar originality in the planning stage, leading up to otherwise not so imaginative direct means of killing. The hope behind the planning is to hoodwink law enforcement, elude detection, and thus to get away with murder, thanks to the killer's superiority of mind and cleverness, if not downright genius, in coming up with a method that had never been thought of before. If we compare the high-profile spousal murders from before the 1960s, such as the Gillette case, with more recent ones, the similarity is that most such murders are done by better educated persons of higher social standings. A key distinction, however, is that modern killers are more apt to resort to hiring a hitman or relying on a close relative to commit the murder, perhaps as clever means of getting around the ever-improving detection methods on the part of law enforcement. In my series of 139 post-1960 uxoricides, for example, there were 30 instances, 21.6%, of solicitation of a hitman or relative to kill the wife. Even more striking was the reliance on a kind of devilish originality in the planning. Let us review a few examples. In 1969, Dr. John Hill was eager to get rid of his wife, Joan, freeing himself to be with his mistress. To that end, Dr. Hill fashioned some pastries containing cultures made from different forms of human waste. Joan became mildly sick from these confections and asked her husband for something to cure her illness. As his newly divorced wife, Anne Kurth, testified at trial, he told me how he had killed Joan with a needle. She did die of overwhelming sepsis, and Dr. Hill became a suspect. There was a trial, ending in a mistrial, and then a second trial arranged for the fall of 1972. A few weeks before the scheduled hearing, Dr. Hill was shot dead by a masked gunman. It was believed that Joan's father, Ash Robinson, had hired the hitman to kill his daughter's murderer. Robinson became the defendant in a new trial as the man responsible for killing Dr. Hill, but he was eventually cleared by a jury several years later. 102 Ed Post, a prominent real estate man from New Orleans, became enamored of his best friend's wife, Kim, and increasingly tired of his wife, Julie, toward whom he had been physically abusive. 103. In 1986, planning to attend a meeting in St. Louis, he drove with Julie to a hotel. During their stay, he drew her bath, making sure the water was just the temperature she liked, and then proceeded to drown her in it. Ed then went for his morning jog, returning to the hotel sometime later, pretending that he discovered her dead in the tub. At first, it did seem like an accident, but during an autopsy, a number of head wounds were found. Though he claimed his innocence, credibly at first, detectives were suspicious on a number of counts. The head injuries appeared to have been inflicted by another person, and were not consistent with having merely slipped and fallen into a tub. Secondly, Ed declined a polygraph exam on the grounds that it was not admissible in court and he was innocent anyway. Finally, he had taken out a $700,000 life insurance policy for Julie the month before her untimely demise. Ultimately, Ed was found guilty at trial and sentenced to life in prison. The common elements in these cases are the staging of an accident or natural death, often worthy of an off-Broadway playwright, coupled with the conviction of the murdering spouse, the dramatist, that every conceivable detail has been considered, such that the unfolding plan is ironclad and the crime will never come to justice. Sometimes the dramas are so similar as to suggest that the later versions are copycat murders. Robert Marshall, for example, was both in major debt and heavily involved with the wife of his Toms River, New Jersey, neighbor .104. In 1984, to kill two birds with one stone, that is, to bring in a large sum and eliminate his current spouse, he took out an insurance policy for $1.5 million and arranged for two hitmen to accost him and kill his wife as he and she drove along the highway. When Robert stopped, as if for a flat tire, the men shot his wife to death, first knocking Robert unconscious, as though their motive was to rob him. Arrested 3 months later, he was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. 5 years later, in Boston, Charles Stewart, perhaps imitating Marshall, or perhaps merely in a great minds think alike coincidence, drove with his pregnant wife to an impoverished neighborhood. He then stopped the car, shot his wife to death, and then fired a bullet into his own stomach, telling police that a manufactured assailant he described as black and 6 feet tall had held them up and shot them in the bellies before fleeing the scene, leading investigators to zero in on an uninvolved man named Willie Bennett .105. There were several motives at play here, including insurance money, the desire to avoid fatherhood, and the freedom to be with a recently acquired mistress. He gave the gun to a brother, whose conscience later compelled him to inform the police about what Charles had done. The scheming killer then took his own life by leaping into Boston's appropriately named Charles River. A few years ago, another highly narcissistic and unscrupulous man, Justin Barber, had gotten into heavy debt and was envious of his more successful wife, April. He had also begun an affair. He hatched a plot, consisting of celebrating their 3rd anniversary by night on a Florida beach. After dinner, he shot April to death with a single bullet, before shooting himself superficially in 4 different places unlikely to prove fatal. He then limped to the police and blamed the attack on a manufactured Mexican man who robbed them before firing shots, explaining that it was dark on the beach and he was unable to describe the assailant any further. It did not escape the attention of the detectives that he had very recently taken out two $2 million insurance policies on each of them. Thank you for tuning in as I go over Dr. Gary Brucato's book, The New Evil. This is to be continued tomorrow. Please check the notification and be sure not to miss. This is 12 Gauge from 12 Gauge Investigative. Watch your 6.